Bonjour and welcome back to the history of the United States since 1877. We've had a couple lectures on World War II so far where we covered first the outbreak of World War II and second some of the fighting between the US and its major enemies, Germany and Japan. We stopped in 1945, which was the victory of the US in that conflict. Let's now focus on the peace settlements after World War II, including the very important issue, what do we do with defeated Germany and defeated Japan? Do we punish them as much as possible, which might feel good but might sow the seeds for future conflict, or do we act in a way that is more merciful, which means that we're not going to punish all the evil doers, but on the other hand, that will allow bygones to be bygones, and maybe we will not have to fight World War III 20 years from now. Specifically, there's an important conference at Yalta in February of 45, which you notice is before the war was over, but by that point it was pretty clear that Germany and Japan were on their last legs. So Russia, Britain, and the US gathered in Yalta, which is in the Crimean Peninsula in southern Russia, to hash out the details for the end of the war. So it's kind of equivalent to the Versailles Treaty that ended World War I. So Germany lost some territories to the east, to Poland, for example. And beyond that, Germany would not just lose territory, but would also be occupied and divided into zones of occupation. So to the east, the Russians would occupy the area around Berlin, what eventually became East Germany. And to the west, you would have a British zone of occupation, an American zone, and also a French zone, even though France was not present at Yalta. And this was supposed to be a temporary thing, but during the Cold War, that hardened into West Germany and East Germany. Beyond that, the capital of Germany, Berlin, happened to be in the Russian zone of occupation. And so this one was divided also into 4 tiny, cute little zones. Initially, that was not supposed to create any problems because Russia and the US and Britain were allies at the time. But when we get to the Cold War and those countries get into a major fight, that became a major issue that you had some French, British, American controlled territories in West Berlin that were deep inside the Russian zone. And that's what we're going to get back to when we talk about the Cold War, the status of West Berlin. Beyond that, at Yalta, different signatories agreed on the Declaration on Liberated Europe, which has something to do with what do we do with all these countries, either in Eastern Europe, like Poland or Czechoslovakia, or Western Europe, like France, that were occupied by the Nazis and are now being liberated. And at the insistence of Franklin Roosevelt, the signatories agreed that there would be some free elections after the war to let the local people in France or Poland or Czechoslovakia decide their own future according to the principle of self-determination, which Stalin agreed to, but not intending to ever fulfill that agreement. And that led to further disputes after World War II, when Stalin refused to have free and fair election in Eastern Europe, establishing puppet regimes of communists instead, and that's one of the reasons that eventually led to the Cold War. So keep that in mind. Also at Yalta, there was a decision to create the United Nations, which would be the successor institution to the League of Nations, some big international forum where representatives from all nations would come together and hash out the differences and hopefully prevent World War III from ever breaking out. In contrast with the League of Nations that had been set up in Switzerland, the United Nations would be set up in New York City, and that's still where it is. Just go to the east side of Manhattan and you'll see the UN building today. As it happened, FDR was quite sick at the Yalta conference. He died shortly thereafter, but his wife, Eleanor, was part of the process to create a charter on human rights for the United Nations after World War II. The successor of FDR in the Oval Office would be his Vice President, Harry S. Truman. Another big question when the war ended would be, what do we do with all the war criminals? And in that case, not people who might have committed war crimes in the US or British Army, because a few of them did. Only the defeated nations get judged. So that would be war criminals from Germany and Japan. And those two countries had committed some immense atrocities. So 2 major war crimes tribunals were set up, one in Nuremberg, which is southern Germany, and the other one in Tokyo, Japan. And the question is, well, do we judge everybody who has committed a war crime, which could be a lot of people? Just the Holocaust by itself in Germany involves thousands upon thousands of people at all levels. And in fact, a lot of the local population have been aware of that as well. So do you prosecute them as well? Or do you decide that only a small minority of people are really responsible and you only judge those? The US made the decision to only prosecute a handful of top-level war criminals. The reason for it was that after World War II, the US would have to occupy Germany. And if you started to denazify the country altogether, then every single university professor and police officer and tax collector and all these people had collaborated with the Nazi regime. So if you get rid of all of them, who is going to run the country? Well, you would need to have a ton of American soldiers present, so the Americans could not be demobilized and sent back home. So that was kind of a pact with the devil, if you will, to let a lot of former Nazis continue to live unmolested, in exchange for which they would run the country. And when we talk about the space program during the Cold War, we'll encounter a man called Werner von Braun, which was a major collaborator of the Nazis. He ran a concentration camp called Dora, where V1 and V2 rockets were devised in order to rain terror on England. Well, after the war, instead of being prosecuted, he was sent to the US to develop more rockets, this time for the US military and NASA. Eventually, the one who developed the massive Saturn V rocket that took Neil Armstrong to the moon. So in the end, you have a process that you might criticize because a number of Nazis don't get properly punished, and that's true also of Japan. The Emperor of Japan, for example, remains in office after the war. On the other hand, you could see that as something a bit more merciful, because after World War I, there had been a big desire to punish Germany, and Germany had wanted vengeance. So now let's have a less vengeful peace, and this way we will patch things up with Germany, and there will be no World War III. Which in a way worked, and the US and Germany have been allies ever since. And instead of punishing Germany, in fact, the UN threw money at Germany under the Marshall Plan, as I mentioned earlier. Quite a bit of money is dumped on Western Europe after World War II, $13 billion worth, and about $1 billion of that goes to Germany to help rebuild the western part of Germany, in the hope that if the Germans are focusing on the economy and the economy is doing well, then they would be not as bitter and less eager to start World War III, and that worked. Another thing that is very connected to being a democracy at war is the fact that your soldiers don't want to be committed abroad forever. After World War II, the Russians kept a lot of divisions, something like 100 of them in Eastern Europe, to occupy all these places and be ready to start World War III. The US, however, because they had mobilized citizens, was under strong pressure to send those back home. And by the US, I mean the Vice President, Harry Truman, was now president. And there was a big campaign around 1945, 46, 47 by spouses of American servicemen to send little baby booties that they had knitted all the way to Congress and maybe the White House with a message that said, "My baby wants his daddy back." And under all that pressure, American troops quickly demobilized. Only 2 US divisions were left in Germany after World War II, as opposed to 100 on the other side, on the Russian side. And you could see how that would connect to a long ideal going back to the days of George Washington and the early US Republic, whereby in peacetime, the US army would be small, you would mobilize during wartime, and then demobilize, something that is called the Cincinnatus ideal. It is named after a Roman peasant or farmer, Cincinnatus, who had answered the call to duty, become dictator of Rome for a while, raised an army, defeated the enemy, and then after a matter of weeks, had returned back to the original farm rather than pursue a career in politics. So that's the notion that you should fight for your country if need be, and then go back to civilian pursuit. And having an army that would be on a war footing throughout, that is called a standing army, that might be a threat to American democracy. So that's still very much alive around 45, 46, though if you told those principles to politicians nowadays, they would have a hard time understanding you because the US has done a complete 180 on the topic. And I think that has to do with the Cold War, because shortly after World War II, the Cold War broke out with Russia. The US was forced to expand its army again, and because the Cold War was long and inconclusive, the US was never quite able to demobilize, not at least for 40 years. And by that point, there was such a long tradition of having a big army on a war footing at all times, and so many military contractors depending on that cash cow, that the army never fully demobilized. And that's especially true in the Republican Party, which used to be very suspicious of government spending, including on the army. In fact, one president of the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower, who was a Republican and a former general, issued a famous speech in which he warned that spending too much money in the army for too long was a threat to American democracy. He warned about the rise of a military-industrial complex. Well, compare that to what, say, a Republican would do today, which is always spending more money on the military. So there's a big kind of a night and day situation there between what used to be American tradition of demobilizing after wars and what is a very, very different tradition today. And that is the story of history. We study the past because some things have never changed, and we also study the past to see what has changed. Well, that's all I have to say about World War II, and that was quite a bit. Time we'll head to another conflict, and that would be Soviet Russia. Au revoir. See you next time.